So anyway, I'm pleased to present our speakers today. Carla Stone is a lecturer in the Second Language Education program, and Corey Matthew is a graduate student in the same program. And they're going to be talking about the research that they did this summer called World Language Teacher Preparation and edTPA, How Alignment and Incongruities Can Inform Continuous Improvement. So please welcome Carla and Corey.
All right. Thank you for coming. And first of all, we want to thank Carla for the opportunity to do this project. It was really invaluable to have Corey on the project this summer, and through the funding from the grant for the summer fellow that allowed us to do that. And we're excited to share with you some of the things we've discovered. Yeah. All right, so starting with the rationale for the project, in the licensure programs in Minnesota and across many states, the edTPA is considered a signature assessment and is required for teacher candidates to get their license. It's also a key formative assessment that we use within the program. In the fall, we have our candidates do a mini version of 2 of the 3 tasks of the edTPA as preparation. And then we also consider it a summative assessment in the spring, where we do local scoring using a modified rubric as part of program completion, so that it raises the stakes a bit and they take it seriously in addition to submitting for licensure. One of the other reasons focusing in on edTPA in particular within the program is that the pass rate is required at 70% for each program. And in world language in particular, our candidates are not achieving at that rate, but it's a complicated picture, and we'll get into some of those complexities. But it also prompted me to need to write program narratives and goals and improvement plans based on the fact that we're not passing at that rate for the State Board of Teaching. And historically within the post-bac program and licensure programs here on campus, there has been more emphasis on English as a second language than world language, mostly because we end up having more candidates seeking that license than we do world language, but it's been continuous feedback that there has not been as much of an emphasis on world language, and so that prompted this laser-like focus on the world language part of the program. And so our program is SLE-ILP for ESL, WL, and CL, which, the long version of that, right, Second Language Education Initial Licensure Program for English as a second language, world languages, and classical languages. So all of those are covered within our program. Most of you are very familiar, but I didn't want to assume familiarity with the program. So this is just a very quick snapshot of what this 12-month program looks like for our candidates. This is the fall schedule. The candidates are in schools Monday through Friday, student teaching in the morning. They're in schools either Monday or Friday all day, and they have some choice with that. They're on campus in class Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday afternoon, and Monday evening, three Tuesday evenings, and every Wednesday evening in the fall semester. And then the spring semester, which is on the next slide, is a very similar heavy schedule. So they're pursuing full-time graduate coursework while student teaching in K through 12 settings and either 2 or 4 placements in 12 months to get the license. So it's a lot, and that's a little bit of the complexity. And some additional food for thought is that candidates can, when they apply, can choose to get 1 or 2 licenses in the same time frame. So for example, in the 2016-17 academic year, which encompasses some of the data that we'll share with you today, we had 22 candidates in total. All of them pursued an ESL license. 1 added Latin in addition to ESL, and 11 added world language in addition to ESL, other than Latin, right? Last year's cohort, we had just 16 candidates. 14 of the 16 pursued an English as a second language license. 1 pursued 2 world language licenses, Chinese and French, as a matter of fact, and 6 pursued ESL plus a world language, right? And so that changes from year to year based on the candidate's preference and whether they've met the prerequisites for proficiency, coursework, etc. And for the edTPA, all of this is a factor because it matters when the edTPA happens depending on when they're doing their student teaching in their second placement. And if you click, right? So those getting 1 license, they're doing their edTPA in this January to April window, and for them it's their second placement. They will have done an elementary placement in either ESL or world language. If they're getting an ESL license, everybody's doing ESL in the fall. And then they're switching to secondary world language for the next placement and doing their edTPA in that setting, right? And that matters because they've been in a different language context as well as a different scope, right, of license.
Yeah, and this is for the single license, and so
Right.
those students who are only world language are actually in an immersion setting in the fall. And so then they're in a completely different context and moving into that secondary world language.
And I should say most are in an immersion setting. This year we were able to secure 2 kind of less, if you will, to use some older terminology, placements, but those are incredibly hard to find. To have teachers who are tenured and willing to take a student teacher and teaching in a K through 5 Spanish program, for example. And so our default is usually immersion settings, even though it's not the right license. The candidates know that, but it's a place where they can get the language practice and experience at that scope of elementary. And so it's a very different setting than jumping from immersion to world language in a secondary setting.
Mm-hmm.
So then the candidates doing 2 licenses end up doing 4 student teaching placements, and their edTPA overlaps and is done during the same time frame, but they're actually beginning their next placement right after Thanksgiving and then ending at the end of February, and have to have all of their edTPA evidence collected and ready to write up and submit by the end of their second placement. So they too will have spent elementary in an ESL placement if they're getting an ESL license. And then are jumping into a secondary world language setting for the context of the edTPA. The edTPA itself has 3 tasks, and in the world language version, there are 4 rubrics under planning, 5 for instruction, and 4 for assessment.
So with all of this in mind, we worked under 3 main guiding questions as we dug into our data. And so we were first looking at, just in general, what trends could we find across their performances across several years of the edTPA data themselves. So we were looking at the scores that they received when they were scored by the edTPA in that official capacity. Then we also wanted to look at in what ways their descriptions of their teaching practices reflected the intentions of the program. And so there we were looking at their actual written reflections as part of the edTPA and comparing that to what the program intends to be teaching for these students. And then finally, as we'll get to at the end, we came up with some instructional changes that would better help them meet the demands of the edTPA and the intentions of the program, actually, as it turned out. So in order to do this, we had a couple different data analysis processes. First, we just did some descriptive analysis of the edTPA scores over 4 years from 2016 to 2018, and we're going to be showing just portions of those scores today because it got a little bit messy of what we were able to access. And then we did a pretty large-scale qualitative analysis of just the first task, so just the planning reflections that students submitted, and just from years 2017 and 2018. And so I did that work through MaxQDA, which is a software, and a lot of inductive coding that came up with numerous codes to start with, just to give you an idea of a list of some of the things that we were looking at. And this isn't even the entire list. These students talk about a lot. If you've never read an edTPA reflection or writing, it's incredibly dense and incredibly convoluted sometimes.
And repetitive.
Yeah. And we'll get to a little bit why that is in a minute. So Carla's going to start just talking us through some of the scores that we found.
Yeah, and so just for a quick comparison, when I pulled the data for edTPA refers to that portfolio as English as an additional language, that's the EAL. So in Minnesota, the license itself is English as a second language at the state level. Our candidates in EAL are passing at nearly 100% and have been since the inception of the edTPA in the program, so they're doing quite well. World language, however, is a slightly different picture. Last year, our passage rate was 50%, but keeping in mind that that was a total of 6 candidates. So that means 3 of them didn't achieve a passing rate on all 3 tasks, and I'm going to show you that in more detail. 2017, our passage rate was 54.5%, and then 2016 was 84.6%. You'll also notice as the N increases, the passage rate increases. And so a really small N in terms of total number of participants and total number of candidates matters. The reason I'm showing you this whole chart is I would just like to point out that in terms of mean scores, while according to the state of Minnesota, our passage rates look pretty poor, right? Our overall mean scores are still higher than national and state averages. And if you break it down by task, all of our candidates, with the exception of a 0.2 difference here last year, the mean score is higher than the passing score. So we had a 12.8 mean score last year in the 2018 hot off the press data, whereas the pass score is 13. So when you calculate it by mean, we're actually not doing that poorly, but when you break it down by individual candidates, it starts to paint a different picture. And that's where we go on to the next slide. So I'm just gonna zoom in, laser-like focus for a second here on last year's scores by task. Right, so we had task 1 is planning, the necessary score to pass is a 10, task 2 is instruction, and then task 3 is assessment. You can see we had one candidate who did very poorly throughout the entire program actually, so this was not a surprise to us at all. So if we take that out as an outlier, right, suddenly our pass rates actually look a little better. And then we had 2 candidates who individually missed one of the 3 tasks, which puts them into the not passing the overall portfolio category, even though they did quite well elsewhere. And one of these was a Spanish language candidate and one was French language candidate. So all of that being said, there's still a lot to learn from why the scores are different for world language than they are for English as an additional language. And so as we were processing the data, as we were looking through all of the codes, and as I was learning Max QDA and how to navigate that, and through our conversations, we kind of came up with this general question of, well, does the edTPA really reflect what our candidates know? And so that's when we started to dig in a little more into the responses. So some of our key findings, when we looked at just edTPA task 1, I think initially we thought we were going to examine all of the portfolios for all of the years and then realize how much work that was, and you could see all of the codes that Corey came up with for just task 1. We came up with a few themes that we wanted to share with you today. And the first one has to do with context and what that means, and I'm going to elaborate on that in just a second. And then the notion of authentic tasks and just authenticity in general. The role of language, specifically forms and functions, and then who and what they're citing, which is a requirement of the edTPA, and that was interesting for us to examine as well. So I'm going to start off by just sharing with you some of the alignment we saw in terms of context and how candidates are understanding the term context. The edTPA requires specific attention to the authentic use of language for communicative purposes in all 3 modes, right? So presentational, interpersonal, and interpretive, right? And we saw and our candidates are doing that. They're mentioning the modes, they're writing their reflection according to this, they're developing communicative tasks for their students. What we saw as incongruities, though, is their understanding or the way they're using this term meaningful cultural context. They're often conflating that with theme or stretching to perhaps write to a rubric, but it doesn't make any sense, right? And so we'll show you an example in just a moment. And then context had another layer to it as well, and that is the context in which their student teaching matters when it comes to the edTPA. And a TPRS context, for example, is challenging in terms of the requirements of the edTPA and the pedagogy that's being utilized in the classroom, and there's a mismatch there. The edTPA defines context essentially as ACTFL defines context in terms of meaningful cultural context, and I've added the bold language down here. And that is just those contexts that encompass sociocultural practices in the world language classroom, in the student's home and community, as well as in the target societies and or cultures that speak the target language. So that's pretty broad, right? Our candidates do a really good job of identifying and connecting with students' home and communities and students' lived experiences and helping to try to make that bridge. And on the next slide, I'll show you a few examples of that. So within the physical context of the classroom and what type of setting it is, in TPRS, the candidate, this is a candidate from last year who had a story called The Barking Mouse in a middle school TPRS classroom, and he went to great lengths to make connections to students' prior learning, as well as their own lived experiences with things like going on a picnic, to help them see connections to the mice in the story from Cuba who went on picnics. And then helping them understand and make some inferences about Cuban culture, though that wasn't the intent of the story in the TPRS setting, right? And so that's an example of, and I think it's, he had to work much harder in making some of those stretches than candidates in other placements did. In a heritage language classroom from 2 years ago, the candidate also did a good job, I think, in the reflection of making those strong connections and comparisons between her students to the Afro-Latinos and in the unit that she was teaching, and the lived experiences of the heritage students in that classroom. And that was a real natural way to contextualize the learning of language for those students. And then the same thing in like a survey course in a middle school French class, learning about school schedules in France and having the Amity scholar there sharing examples of that in a real authentic contextualized space. And then street fashion in the Francophone world was another theme from a kind of a traditional high school French classroom, where the connections there were to students as adolescents who like fashion was the link to making that a meaningful context. And it seemed to work, I think, fairly well. And in the red, we see the stretch where clearly this candidate is looking at the rubric and just making this claim that in a meaningful cultural context, we can discuss if Valentine's Day is celebrated, blah, 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 right? And for those of us who know the program and know the candidate, we think, no, right? Okay. This is what the rubric looks like. So this is rubric 1 in the task 1 for planning. And the guiding question is, how do candidates' plans develop students' communicative proficiency in the target language in meaningful cultural context? So this is what the edTPA is asking for and demanding. But you'll notice they don't actually have to do that until they want to get a score of a 4 or a 5. And generally a 3 is considered a passing score. So there's some incongruities even in just the demands of the edTPA and in terms of how the edTPA is scored as well.
All right, so now we're going to move to talking about authenticity and authentic tasks. And this came up over and over throughout the data, and it really prompted some interesting conversations between CARLA and myself about, well, what do we mean by authenticity in the program? How are we defining this, and what are we expecting of our students? And that maybe some of our expectations were too high, and we needed to lower them a little bit to match what the edTPA and really what ACTFL is asking for. But in general, for alignment, we saw that a couple of students who did use the integrated performance assessment as a model seemed to be more successful in embedding authentic tasks in a way that really did seem to fit into those meaningful cultural contexts that CARLA was just describing. So the more that we can maybe push and encourage the IPA, as we already do, might be helpful with that. And we also saw a lot of use of authentic materials, and in this case, we're really just basic definition of materials from the target culture. Students were really trying to use them as much as possible, which we think is fantastic. And then we did see some really interesting incongruities, which I'll explain more in a second, but essentially that some students were conflating or confusing the medium of the task with authenticity. And then also similarly that they were confusing a language function versus the method of delivery that language function was occurring within. And I'll explain that in a moment. But before I get there, we just wanted to share some definitions of authentic. And so this is a new definition from a new book that CARLA is teaching this year, which is how authenticity is being talked about now in the program, which is not so different from how it was taught in the past. Essentially that students are able to apply learning to real or simulated situations that could happen beyond the classroom. So a pretty basic definition of authenticity. And then the edTPA talks about authentic input being found in the real world. And then down here, it explains a number of types of authentic input. We see music videos, movies, short films, etc. And then also any work created by students for genuine communicative purposes such as dialogues, posters, writings, journals, etc. I want to highlight particularly the posters and the journals because we're going to come back to this and see this appear in our examples. And so we see how the students, for better or for worse, probably for better, are reading the edTPA handbook. They are drawing on this, but then they're sometimes stretching or misapplying it in what they write in their reflections. So in terms of alignment, these are some examples where we felt a student really did get this idea of authentic task, and the edTPA was showing that this candidate understood what this really meant. So one candidate in a Chinese class, the students will be researching information on a city as one part of their assessment, and then they're going to write a postcard to someone about that information that they learned, and I think it was about a trip that they supposedly did to that city, right? So it's pretty hypothetical, but it's really embedded in some of that real world communication that could occur. Another student had her teacher candidate had her students giving advice over the phone even, and so then there was a contextual context, communicative context that students needed to modify their language within as they're giving that advice over the phone. In another way of looking at it, this was a case where we thought the student was sort of conflating the medium of the task with authenticity. So this is actually the same student having 3 tasks back to back. And so the first task, she had students write a strong opinion about something and then tried to argue that that writing was like a journal or diary. So there we see that journal, and so it was then therefore authentic. But within the context of the reflection, it was very clear that this writing opinion was really still an academic task. It was not a journal entry. And so the students would still experience that as an academic task, and it wouldn't feel like an authentic task for them. So we see our teacher candidate stretching this idea by saying, oh, I can do a journal, it'll be authentic. But then the second one, they go on to write to a pen pal. This is a different student, but similar to pen pals. But in this case, they actually are working with this pen pal, and it's a real person, and they're writing back and forth. So this is sort of the star example, gold star of authentic communication, which is above and beyond what we expect our teacher candidates to be able to pull together in their time. But then we move back to the third one, which I think Carla and I are still sort of scratching our heads over at times, where teacher candidate has the students in a simulation of sitting in a school cafeteria where they're discussing opinions about bullfighting, which was the overall context, and then argues or acknowledges the context is not real, it's similar to something they would do, eating sandwiches in a cafeteria, and we really enjoyed that they included that detail.
Eating sandwiches is really very authentic, and
yeah.
So it makes me chuckle every time, and this was written into the actual idea.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh my God.
And it makes us wonder then to what level does it matter how the students would experience the simulation? They would probably still see that they're sharing opinions about bullfighting. So is this something they really do in their cafeteria while they eat their sandwiches? Or is the fact that the teacher candidate was trying to make that connection, is that really as far as we can expect them to go and actually a good thing for this context? So we're not sure how we feel about that last one.
And this one I have to say too was also a TPRS setting with an attempt to contextualize it further, because this candidate had been in Spain and did also then have one of her friends in Spain send a video talking about her opinion of bullfighting, and so she did bring in some very meaningful, authentic context, and then had to, but the writing for the edTPA stretches a little bit while eating sandwiches in the cafeteria.
And then we see another example in this category of conflating the language function and the method of delivery. So if you come all the way down here to the bottom, the function the students are doing are expressing and sharing food preferences, which we would consider a perfectly reasonable, authentic language function, but they're doing it through a poster presentation. And so then we go back, we see that the edTPA told them a poster was authentic input, but I don't normally express my food preferences by making a poster to show that. And so there's some confusion or a stretch, once again, to try to make something authentic when the function doesn't really match the mode of delivery in which that's happening. We also came across another topic. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly just for time's sake. Okay. A lot of students were using social media in different ways as resources for authenticity, for authentic materials. And we were very happy to see that. We saw it provide a lot of opportunities for some of that real communication, like what Carla was just talking about. But it did make us wonder if in the program there needs to be some more discussion about the fact that using social media or electronic resources doesn't inherently make something authentic, depending on how it's used, right? So we see this example over here in the blue, where students are presenting information from articles about social media, which is an authentic task. And sure, we all present information at any time, but it seemed that the student was saying because it's about social media, it's something the students talk about. But once again, they probably don't usually read articles and then present the information about social media. And so it felt like a stretch. Similarly, we had a student over here who was using those resources to look at language, which we think is really fantastic, but who was trying to argue that then that was an authentic experience because they were using an authentic text. But if they're just looking for direct object pronouns, there's some confusion or conflation there. And so something that we were talking about is how do we teach about social media?
Versus authentic, meaningful cultural context and the task, right? And I think this piece is really important given the college-wide emphasis in teacher education on technology this year. So all of our candidates are getting additional training, including ours this afternoon. They've been given iPads, instructors and program leads have been given a lot of additional training, so there's this big push to use technology in new and meaningful ways. And so that, I think many of our candidates then glam onto the social media connections, which is very engaging for candidates. And so yeah, it gets to these nuanced, really layered conversations that we can then have about, does that automatically mean it's authentic in terms of the task?
So the next category that we discovered was the role of language within the edTPAs, and this is something I'm always really interested in and really focusing in on, and so I noticed it quite a bit throughout the reflections. The first thing that we saw for alignment, we were really happy actually to see that 13 out of 15 of the students whose work I looked at did organize their units and their teaching from a more communicative perspective. So whether it be CBI or TPRS or what I was calling a functional organization, where they would say we're teaching this function, or a thematic. And only 2 said, I'm teaching the present tense. And so we were very happy to see that, because when you watch or when you go in and observe them in their student teaching, oftentimes they're still teaching chapter 5, which has to do with the present tense. And so we were glad to see that they could apply what's been taught in the program at least to one unit, even when they're not seeing it necessarily in their student teaching context. But that being said, we did notice that there were, we're calling narrow examples of language forms and functions throughout, and basically a limited range of examples as you read through their reflections of the forms and functions they were talking about. And then also some misalignment between their students' proficiencies and the forms and functions they said that they were teaching. And we wanted to point out that this misalignment is actually very interesting, because the edTPA itself suggests 6 functions that students should or could use, and then gives them room for one other that they can add in. And so in a way, the edTPA is creating washback on their performance by then they're narrowing and only using maybe 6 functions. So it's a misalignment between the edTPA and our program, where we give them and talk about a much wider range of functions and forms that we would expect them to be teaching.
And that's true across all of the edTPA portfolios, so it's fantastic for the math portfolio, the science and the social studies and the English language arts, because it really draws attention to the language and the academic language piece. For our candidates, we're encouraging them to think a bit more broadly in terms of the communicative function.
And so that's demonstrated here. This is not an exhaustive list of all the forms and functions throughout the samples that we looked at, but it's very representative. And so you see here the functions, we have a lot of describing, some opinions, some advice, one doing compare and contrast, and I've organized them directly across. And so, the first person would say we're going to use the plural or third person plural verb to describe. That's how this is set up. And you see then the forms they're using that we have a lot of conditional. We have, a couple present tense and grammatical gender, and one that gets a little bit syntactic, and that's it. It was all grammatically based and very narrow examples therein also. And it's something that we also see in their student teaching, and we push them to be thinking about other forms and other functions that they could be teaching. We should note, and I think that we didn't mention this before, that the world language students don't take a grammar class, where the ESL students do take an English grammar class, and the world language students are assumed to have had some type of grammar in their background as they've learned their world language, because it's often their second language, though not always.
Right. So the candidates getting only a world language or 2 world language licenses will not take the grammar class, but if they are also getting an ESL license, they'll have that class that Kendall's teaching this year. And so I think that matters for some of the candidates where we know the individuals involved and some of the challenges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then our last example here is where we're talking about that misalignment between the functions and the proficiency levels. And so if we look at this student, she's talking about expanding students' communicative abilities and strategies by increasing their familiarity with description, expression of opinions, reactions to other ideas, with complex multi-clause utterances. And this paragraph in and of itself actually reads quite nicely, that she's got some understanding of a range of functions, and she's going to be pushing at the discourse level, not just a certain grammatical form. But then when you go look at a different part of her reflection, you see that she says that the students fall into 2 primary segments, with novice low and novice intermediate students, and some being up to novice high. And if you're familiar with ACTFL proficiency scales at all, a novice high student even is not creating complex multi-clause utterances. And so this student knew that this sounded good for the edTPA, but it doesn't match whatsoever with what should have been going on in her classroom. We hope this wasn't happening in her classroom, because if it was, her students wouldn't have been getting anything out of it based on their proficiency level. Interestingly enough, when I found this discrepancy, I went back and looked at her score, and she had actually passed and done quite well. And so the edTPA is also not catching that there's some type of problem here in this type of misalignment. All right, last section.
Yep, and so then just very briefly, we just did we did a count of the number of citations and then tracked how many citations were repeated. And the alignment is that there is a requirement to explicitly connect research and theory in order to score a 3 or higher on several of the rubrics. And in our sample, over 57 different sources were cited by candidates. The majority, though, were not SLA research. It was a lot of kind of practical text that we share with them on differentiation and and so not grounded in theory to the extent to which we'd like to, or in the program, we'd like them to be doing so for our master's level program. And so this is just an example of the rubric where, interestingly enough, in the edTPA, you can score a 3 if your connections to research and theory are superficial, and a 3 is a passing score. And so then in order to have those solid connections, that would push you into the 4 or 5, which of course we want our candidates to also score high, but be demonstrating not only to the edTPA, but to us programmatically as their final summative assessment for the program that they're making good connections, meaningful research-based connections. And that's where they're falling a little bit short. So through all of this, as we were going through and analyzing, we were also taking notes on concrete steps and pedagogical changes to the program, some of which have already been implemented, and so we're just going to share a couple of them here quickly. First was to inductively build a definition of what is a meaningful cultural context. We actually did this yesterday in my class. We had a really productive, good conversation of what does that even mean before introducing the edTPA rubrics, and from a backwards design perspective then of where we're headed.
And I'll add about that I did an observation just this morning and was able to talk about meaningful cultural context, which didn't exist in her lesson, and how she might be able to tie it in. So we're trying to build it in, not just in the classes, but in our observations as well.
We're spending more time on this notion of what is an authentic task in assessment. The incongruity here is that that's not what they're seeing in elementary placements. They're seeing a lot of guided reading and the letter of the day or the 3 words of the day, and to contextualize those and make them feel authentic is a real challenge when that's not the setting in which they're doing their student teaching at the moment, but we have good discussions about that. And they came up with some good examples yesterday of how they could contextualize it if they had more control over the setting. We also spent some time just identifying common units and themes, brainstorming good essential questions, and then performance tasks that require authentic output of language in meaningful ways. So we've started doing more of that. And then even this, we just got to the tail end of this yesterday, and we'll continue to do this moving forward, but with any given function, what are the specific language patterns and forms needed to execute that function? So if you're describing, what does that mean within your task, and what specific kinds of language do you need? So tying into the grammar class, like what do you know about, right? And so that they're just building some muscle memory in how to talk about the forms that align with the various functions and move beyond present tense, third person singular. We're doing more analysis of learner language in the program than we have before. They do that in the SLA class, in the grammar class. We're trying to make that an integral part of the assignments they're doing in the methods courses as well. So as they focus on one learner throughout the semester, they're gathering samples of oral language, written language, looking at the WIDA or actual rubrics, making their own self-determinations on what proficiency level based on evidence, and just building that into a more of a regular practice than we've done in the past. And engaging with a critical analysis of, an introduction to and analysis of TPRS and comprehensible input, which is really hot right now in the world language settings in locally. Many of them will be placed in these settings for student teaching, but trying to sort of unpack the strengths, but also some of the challenges in teaching in that, with that pedagogical framework. And then we're requiring more frequent references to actual research in some of the assignments than perhaps we've done in the past. It's a very practical, technical program in terms of getting a license issued by the state of Minnesota, but it's also at the graduate level, and they are earning an MED at the end. And so it's this balance of getting them through and also like master's level work. Constant tension. But the most exciting outcome, I think, that we're both pretty excited about is this idea of adding in some more video analysis and base group. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, so going through the data more and more, I was really inspired to think about how we could, as Carla was kind of saying, build up some of these skills and some of this muscle memory and build up the students' ability to notice more what's going on in their classrooms. Because as I read their reflections, kind of like that one we showed at the end, there were a lot of moments where I was sort of like, I don't think that's what's really happening in your classroom. And so we teach a class called CI 5699, and we call it base group, and it's where we as clinical supervisors who work with the students in their placements meet with them once a week in smaller groups to debrief about their placements, but also to build on some of the skills that they're learning in seminar. And we're building into this a video analysis assignment. And so 6 times over the course of the whole year, broken up among their placements, they'll be videotaping, recording themselves in their placements, bringing it into our base groups, and we're going to be watching them as a group and analyzing some of the classroom interaction, analyzing what we see about the language, seeing if we can pick out their language objective from what actually happens in the classroom, and really getting them much more comfortable with noticing what's going on in their own space, and with taking some of that analysis and critique on their own teaching practices. And then they'll be writing written reflections after each of those analysis sessions where their own video is looked at, where they kind of think about what were some of the aha moments, what things they agreed, disagreed with, etc. And Carla and I are hoping that we'll be able to then use those reflections as a continuation study to see if this video analysis pedagogy helps them build up some of these skills that we are seeing maybe lacking in their reflections on the edTPA. So we're very excited. They're a little nervous, but they'll get over that. and yeah, we're starting next week actually with our first video.
Yeah,
so.
I'm really excited. Just this idea of show the video and let the group decide what they see as the language and come up with what would have been a good language objective and see if that matches or aligns at all with what the written language objective was, and then the conversation about the in-between, right, and the learning that can happen from that. So we'll see.
Yeah.
To be continued.
Yeah. So.
So we're really anxious to get feedback or hear your questions.
Oh, thank you. That's super interesting. So you kind of suggested this, but I wanted to see if you'd be willing or able to say more, that potentially the students who were heritage language learners or had learned the language conversationally as opposed to formally seem to struggle more at picking out those kind of grammatical forms. Is that
Oh, I
What
think
you
it
were
was more
suggesting?
the heritage setting, if the student teaching placement was a heritage classroom, more so than our heritage learners.
Okay.
Although,
I think
well,
what I said is that, from what I understand, the underlying assumption of the program is that a non-native speaker would have picked up some grammar as they learned the language.
right.
And so a heritage speaker maybe never had a grammar class in their own native language, but we don't have any data, we haven't really compared how that affects.
And
That would
yeah,
make
it would make
Yes,
sense, right?
yeah.
Yeah. And the one outlier last year was a heritage speaker, a native speaker of her language, and she's struggled with proficiency in English all the way through the program. And so I think the academic writing and just the sheer volume of information that candidates take in this intensive program, and then the need to write to things like the edTPA was a struggle, along with a few other things in that particular case. And then if we go back further than the data we've analyzed, we've also had heritage speakers who excelled and scored the highest on the TPA. So it's hard for everybody.
we don't
Yeah.
suggest that it's
Right.
Do you guys have plans to look at the other parts of the edTPA, because you looked at just one part, right?
We did. So I've looked a bit at task 3 simply because that's where historically over the last, I think I had 5 years of data, world language candidates on rubrics 8 and 9 in particular have the lowest scores. And those have to do with making connections between students' home communities and language to the target language and culture. So we've been working hard on that over the last couple of years to help them connect with their students, know their learners, and make explicit connections between their life as teenagers in the United States to, right? And with the 2018 data, we saw an improvement there. But I did have to go back and write that up in terms of SMART goals for the Office of Teacher Ed in the program narratives, because those were the lowest areas. I think the most productive part of this for me was the conversations we were having, not necessarily even tied to the specific research questions that we came up with when I submitted the proposal for the project, but just all of these sort of just learning and the nuances and the other noticings that were popping up as we talked through this. So I think the video analysis project, the focus on language through that, along with this continued exploration of authenticity and what makes a context meaningful, is where I want to put my energies versus going back and looking at past data. Because I think we've pointed out a few of the inconsistencies with just even like the demands of the edTPA, mostly aligning with the intent of our program and our goals of the program, but then also having a little bit of a mismatch. In fact, I think we have higher expectations for the role of language in a world language licensure program than is evident in the edTPA, where there's really only one mention in rubric number 1 of having a match between form and function in teaching as they're planning their lessons. Otherwise, it's not focused on as much as we tend to in our program.
Yeah.
So then as an assessment, it's not fully capturing what we're doing.
Yeah, when we were creating the PowerPoint, we actually looked through the rubrics to find a rubric to match that world language section, because we have rubrics for the other ones, and we were reminded and disappointed that there's truly only one rubric that talks about language in a language instruction assessment. So,
what role does the student's placement have on this whole experience? It seems like for some of them trying to, make some kind of connection between where they are actually teaching, if they're in a situation where making those connections are harder, just harder to do. I'm sure you've spent a lot of time thinking about where they should be placed, but what do you see in this data and in your program?
I think the placement plays a big role, actually, honestly. And the best placements are those where the candidates have some flexibility and freedom to design their own units and aren't tied to a particular scope and sequence and schedule, right? the TPRS settings in the middle school are the most challenging, but they also learn a lot from those settings and placements, and those teachers are willing to host our candidates, and sometimes it comes down to we just need a placement. And we're still in that mode for the most part. We're like slowly building up a newer base of cooperating teachers based on personal connections now that I have. But since I'm fairly new in this role, I didn't have the same connections that my predecessor did with like individual people to reach out to, and so we'll kind of take what we can get until we develop those relationships and learn more. So I think we're being more strategic though. Like we deliberately sought a placement that is nearly 100% secured, fingers crossed everybody, with a teacher who does a lot with IPAs and Wayzata. And that's for a candidate who asked for that, who came in with a strong background in language teaching in non-school-based settings, and assessment was the area he wanted to have the most growth in, and asked for that. And I think we're going to be able to make that match, but we can't do that for everybody for the multiple placements, but we're getting better. So I think the context plays a big, big role. And the heritage language classes, honestly, are terrible places to do the edTPA, because the focus in most of them is not on language development as much as some of the other cultural and identity and really important aspects for the kids in those programs, in Minneapolis at least. But depending on the teacher, our experience has been that it can be really hard to do an edTPA in that setting. So even though they're great experiences, we can't always use those sites for student teaching. We can try to get them in through practicum or something else.
So do you tell your students how much of this data did you share with them?
I told them that I was doing the presentation and that some of the things we were talking through like yesterday was as a result of poor performance historically on the edTPA, and that got their attention. And then, like, okay. So I didn't share the whole presentation, but I did mention and talk about why we're doing it, and been trying to share even just like how reporting works and how scoring works, and if they don't do well, these are the consequences for them and for me and for the program, and just like the behind the scenes, sort of giving them a little insight into how complicated it is to run a program for multiple languages K through 12. And they seem to get it then too, and it also just helps with having patience when everybody else has a placement and one or two don't, and just explaining the challenges there. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I just want to say a special thank you to Corey for really pushing me in the world language domain and asking good questions, and it's been great working with her, so I just appreciate having her on the team. Thanks. Yeah.